And I don't have to have a microphone, or did I have a microphone?
Okay.
Well, I guess my dad and Pat had got to know each other pretty well working down in the hills down there getting outposts. And Pat had told him about several bee trees that the folks went down and cut and saved the honey, and then they'd put it in fruit jars and take it to town and sell it. And Pat had told my dad about needing somebody to stay with Grandma because she was there all alone, days and nights that he was getting out posts. And so, and I guess he told the folks too, or at least my dad, about Grandma and her Bible and how she would do. And they had a Mexican girl staying there with her, and she was reading out of the Bible, reading loud, and then she got up to preaching and clapping her hands and walking the floor, and it scared that girl. And she lived over in those hills, well, north of Comstocks there in that Reed Gulch deal. And she walked clear home. She got scared. And he told him all about all that. And then when Pat came over and got me, and he was there for dinner, and Mama had fresh light bread. And he really liked that light bread. And he wanted to buy a loaf of that. And she told him that I knew how to bake light bread. And I think she gave him a loaf, or he bought a loaf or something anyhow. That was the first thing I had to do there. So after I got over there was make some light bread to take on his camping down in the hills. And Grandma, I don't guess she ever knew how to make light bread. I don't know. But she made cornbread. So I'd make light bread and she'd make cornbread, and she'd eat that old hard cornbread, soak it in her coffee and everything. The only trouble I had with my light bread, I'd make too much because I was used to making for the family. And when I walked in, though, Grandma was sitting in a little chair. She said that Willie had bought her that little chair, little rocking chair. And she sitting there, and it was low and small. And she was sitting there in that chair, smoking her old corncob pipe. And she'd mixed tobacco and mullein in that pipe. And so I stayed there with Grandma, and I got along real well, and till after Will come home from the army. But while we were, before he ever came home, though, was a man by the name of Garrett Coleman that got acquainted with Uncle Jim. Uncle Jim was living in Canyon, and this Garrett Coleman brought his daughter from Kansas. She had TB, and Uncle Jim was guard there in the Royal Gorge on the railroad. and they got acquainted, and they found out that they were cousins, that their dads, Garrett's dad and Grandpa Josh was brothers. So that made them full cousins. And he came up there and stayed several days and went down in the woods and helped Pat cut posts. And they had quite a stack, I guess, down there. And couldn't haul them all home at once. And then he went back to Canyon, and I never seen him anymore, but I did hear about him. And then Uncle Abe and Uncle Lee would take turnabout coming out every year to visit with them. And when Will got called up from the Mexican border where the National Guard was, why, they'd sent him to Fort Logan and then put him in the regular army and gave him 10 days of leave before they shipped him to France, because they were already trained and everything, and they went right on to France. And he asked me to write to him, which I did, and I cut out jokes and things out of the magazines they had. They'd taken this Kansas Farmer Reese and Capper's Weekly and then interesting things out of the Tribune. I didn't have much to write about, so I'd send them all those clippings. Grandma thought that was just crazy. Kid stuff, she called it. But then when Will came home, why, he looked at me so straight when he came in, and he says, "If I didn't know it was you, I wouldn't know you. When I left, you was just a kid in pigtails, and here you, 3 years later, you're a young woman." And Grandma says, "Yes, full of kid stuff." And he said, well, he cutting out all those things and mailing them. He said, well, we sure enjoyed those kid stuff. He says, I'd read them through a few times and give them to my buddies, and they'd give them to their buddies, and says, I bet they was worn out before. And she didn't like that at all. And so he didn't stay around home too long. When he first came back, he had to get a job, and he wanted to get his motorcycle shipped out to him, and he'd stored it in California. And he wanted, I guess he probably owed some storage on it and everything. He had to get a job, so he went in and started working for Mercier's at the garage. And from there, why, he, that winter, why, Mercier's just closed down their garage. They didn't have any cars that could get through the snow and ice. So Pop started carrying mail, and he carried the mail with a sleigh and a team. And he had to leave by daylight and didn't get back by dark because he had a long, a lot of miles to go. And in the winter time, the days were short. And he stayed there in the garage. There was a little room with a bed in it, fixed up as a bed for a night man. And he kept the fires going at night, and got his room then free. And Mrs. Shively there at the hotel had fixed him a lunch. He said it was usually frozen, but then he ate a lunch. And he bought an old car and overhauled it and everything, and put overload springs on it so he could haul gas and oil and stuff out. He had his mind made up he was going to buy a tractor, and the machinery to go with it. And he'd plow for these farmers around and make enough money that he could buy grain and gas and stuff to put in a big crop at home. And that's what he did. But then long in towards spring 1920, why he came home in 1919 in May, and along towards spring when it began, Fort thawed out, why they got a telegram and he brought it out, and it was signed Belle Duncan Best, and nobody knew who she was, but she'd be there in just a day or so to meet the train. And Grandma said, well, one of her sisters married a man by the name of Duncan. It had to be her, or one of his kids. And so Will hired a car and brought her out. And to find out it was her sister's daughter. And she told a story about how she got found out about him so many times that she was visiting there in Kansas, and there's a man came to the door, and she says, oh, it's my milkman, and says, come in, Garrett, and have a cup of coffee and meet a lady from the old hometown. And so she introduced him to Aunt Belle, to Garrett Coleman. And Aunt Belle says, well, my Aunt Catherine married a man by the name of Coleman, Josh Coleman. And he says, well, where are they now? And she says she didn't know that they'd left Missouri years ago and went to Arkansas. And she had heard that they had left Arkansas and went to Oklahoma, but she didn't know where they were. And he says, oh, they didn't stay in Oklahoma too long. They moved to Colorado. And said they live at Westcliff now. And then he told her that he was Grandpa Josh was dead, and he had some cousins lived out here. And her Aunt Catherine lived with one of them at Westcliff. And so that's when she sent the telegram right away that she wanted, and she came out and visited them. And